First of all, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jason Marzek. I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here, and it's my great pleasure to be in the company of such distinguished guests and to be hosting this event today on Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations and Latin America and the world. This is the second in a three-part series on Mexico's 2018 election that's featuring top advisors to each of the three campaigns. And Sergio Alcocer, we're so excited to have you here today from the campaign of José Antonio Meade to give your perspectives. This is a series that we're doing in conjunction and collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Duncan, Chris, great to be doing. This is now the second event in 2 weeks. And we will be having yet another event together next week when we welcome Solomon Chertorivsky from the Anaya campaign. But Sergio, it's really such a pleasure to have you here, not only to talk about José Antonio Meade's campaign, his policy proposals, his perspectives on bilateral relations, but of course, Sergio is probably no stranger to most of you in this room. You bring your own wealth of experience and insights and analysis. I'll formally introduce you when we start our conversation, but through the numerous roles that you've had. As everybody's aware, on July 1st, the Mexican people will go to the voting booth to elect their next president, and this comes at a time of, I think, unprecedented domestic, but also regional questions about where Mexico is heading, specifically on issues of trade and economic development. One burning question is the fact that there, at this point, still is. There's been a lot of talk about this, but there still is not any type of preliminary agreement on NAFTA negotiations, and without that, before the election, this will be an issue for the next president to deal with, as well as questions that are surfacing in the campaign on Mexico's energy reforms, and also broader regional questions as well. I think we at the Atlantic Council, we see this as really a moment, a critical moment in the Americas and Mexico. We call it an inflection point, although Fred Kemp, our president, likes to talk about a lot of global events as being inflection points, but I think specifically what's happening in Mexico is one, and that's why we've doubled down on our work on Mexico. We last year published a study highlighting the importance of NAFTA amidst very tense negotiations. David Goldwyn, who's a fellow in the Latin America Center, but also a chairman of our Global Energy Center, has published numerous reports on Mexico's energy reforms, and we also had the pleasure of hosting José Antonio Meade for his last public event in Washington as Secretary of Finance back last fall. And then coming next week, not only will we be hosting the Solomon Chertorivsky from the Anaya campaign, but then we'll be in Scottsdale, Arizona, next Friday to lead the opening session of the North American Governors Summit as well. So this is such a critical time for Mexico, such a critical time for U.S.-Mexico bilateral relations, and makes it all the more imperative, Sergio, to hear your thoughts and analysis on where we're going moving forward. So with that, I want to again thank the Wilson Center for partnering on these events, and turn it over to Duncan for a few comments. And then Sergio and I will come back up and take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everybody. Great pleasure to be here. And let me just say that the collaborations between think tanks in Washington is one of the most important strengths that I think we have. Yesterday, Chris and I were interviewing candidates for a new position at the Mexico Institute, and one of the questions that came up was, how do you work with other think tanks? And it was fabulous to be able to say, well, tomorrow we've got another event with the Atlantic Council. We work very closely with the Inter-American Dialogue. We work with the Council of the Americas. We work with Brookings. We work with, and when I first came to Washington 5 years ago, people said to me, oh, it's an incredibly competitive space, and you're fighting over very small stakes, so it's incredibly bitter. But the fact is that we've been able to forge great collaborative relationships. So Jason, thank you very much for having us here. You've always been an incredibly friendly and collaborative partner. Sergio, welcome. It's great to have you back again. As we said in the private breakfast, I have an enormous amount of respect for you as a person, as a public servant. You've always been terrifically supportive You are a frank and honest speaker, and that's much appreciated these days in particular. I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Good luck on the campaign trail. I know it's brutal, and your family and friends are probably not seeing you as much as they would like. Let me just give a couple of small plugs for papers that we're releasing. Well, actually, one that we've just released on the role of fake polls in Mexican politics by Jorge Buendia. It's an interesting examination of how polls have been used to influence voters in the past. And I know that many people in the other campaigns will be hoping that all of the polls in Mexico are fake right now, but it's probably not the case. And we're just about to launch a new paper, a critical evaluation of the energy reform of 2013, which is the result of a series of consultations that we took with private sector representatives and analysts in Mexico over the period of a few weeks. That paper, which is produced with consulting firm IPD, Latin America, will be published in the next few days up on our website. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, a new paper that Ambassador Tony Wayne has headed up with Raquel Chaufet, which looks at workforce development as an issue for North American collaboration and cooperation. Very, very important issue. It's one of the issues that's being discussed in the NAFTA negotiations. I know it's an issue that Sergio cares about a great deal when he was Undersecretary for North America. And so I'm very glad that we've given some continuation, some seguimiento to that issue, Sergio. So without any further ado, thank you very much for being here, and I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
So Sergio and I are we're gonna have a fun, informal conversation for about 25 minutes, and then turn it over to questions from everybody in the audience. Again, this is a public discussion, so feel free to get out your phones, but hopefully not to check email. Hopefully it's just to tweet about how interesting this event is. And when you do that, please, I think we're using the hashtag today, AC Mexico, and there's probably a corollary hashtag for the Wilson Center. Let me know if we're happy to announce that. So let me just take a moment. I think Sergio was somebody that, as I said before, is no stranger to anybody in this room, has such a breadth of experience, doesn't need an introduction, but as I said before in the breakfast, it's always helpful to have an introduction. Sergio is the founder and president of Mexico Exponencial. It's a think tank which looks at the development of public policy and strategies for embracing exponential technologies in the fourth industrial revolution in Mexico. Is such a critical topic, Sergio.
It's very interesting, yeah.
And that's something I think we'd like to hear more about during this discussion as well. He also, of course, also serves as Special Projects and Government Program Coordinator for the campaign of José Antonio Meade as part of the coalition Everyone for Mexico. He's also a research professor at UNAM. He's also served as Undersecretary for North American Affairs for just about 2 years, 3 years. And he also served as Undersecretary for Strategic Planning and Technology Development, the Secretary of Energy, as well as Secretary General and Coordinator for Innovation and Development and the Director of the Institute of Engineering at UNAM. And we could probably spend the next 5 minutes talking about all the other things that you've done over the course of your career, but let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
And just welcome you here. Let me start off with a personal question to kick this discussion off. Why did you join the Meade campaign? What in particular attracted you to his candidacy? As Duncan was saying, being a part of a campaign, it means lots of time on the road, lots of time away from your family. So what was it that motivated you to join the Meade campaign?
Well, before answering the question, I just want to say good morning to everyone, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council, and Jason, to you, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center. It's always good to see good friends. Duncan, thank you very much, and also to see other friends from Mexico being here. And I joined the campaign because if you were going to, the answer will be very simple. If you were going to ask me who would I give my children or leave my children to be taken care of, I will say José Antonio. I think he's a very honorable, he's a wise man, he's a very well prepared, very efficient person, and we share the vision of a country that needs to be more prosperous and needs to move much faster and to be more inclusive. And that prompted me to help him in the campaign. And although there are consequences for this in terms of the time and the effort that you need to devote for this sort of activity, I think the country needs that kind of a vision. And the only person that I think has that vision is José Antonio. That's I'm pretty sure, and that's why I'm helping him in the campaign.
So there's a number of different issues that are front and center for Mexicans as we look toward the vote on July 1st. Some of them, maybe from the international community, we might see some issues as being critical, whereas for Mexico, for Mexicans, there's other issues that are more front and center in people's minds. From the Meade campaign perspective, what do you see as the top issues for voters and the top issues under which people will be making their decision come July 1?
I will say that there are 4 issues in Mexico that are relevant for a typical voter. The single first one, I think, is insecurity. That is certainly the most significant one, not only in big cities, but in small cities. And is hardly felt by the most voters. This is particularly true among women. And so I think insecurity will be the first one. Secondly, will be the economy itself. So the quality of employment, the amount of employment, and the salaries involved. The third one will be the quality of life, spelled or explained in the quality of services in small towns and cities. And the fourth one has to do with corruption. And I will put them in that very same order. That may not be the order in which you will read them in the newspaper in Mexico, because I do think that the perception about corruption has been pretty much fueled by the media. Not saying that corruption doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that in the people's mind, corruption, I don't think, is as important as other topics. And I think those 4 will be the main 4 topics. And you could, in some cases, sort of package them in terms of rule of law. Certainly that has to do with justice and security and corruption. So if you were going to say that rule of law is a significant problem, yet that includes these two topics that I mentioned. But perhaps people won't expel it that way of rule of law, because that won't be the way that people would understand it.
So given insecurity, the economy, quality of life, corruption, what are the proposals, if you could, the proposals of the Meade campaign to address each of those concerns, and maybe also how does the Meade campaign's proposals differ from those of the other top contenders?
Well, first of all, I will say that the proposals of Dr. Meade are based on a very wide knowledge of the country, which departs from the diagnostics from the other campaigns. He has been, as you know, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of the Finance, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and Secretary of Social Development. That gives him the best positions possible to understand the complexities and the diversities, the challenges, the inequalities that the country has. Firstly, on the security side, we need to acknowledge that the strategy that has been put forth by both Presidents Calderón and Peña have not worked. And there is a chaos in terms of the application of the justice system in Mexico. And you need to change, you need to have a very deep re-engineering of the justice system in Mexico. And you need to change the strategy in terms of fighting against security in Mexico at large. He has been, Dr. Meade has been proposing very specific ways of solving those problems. Firstly, on the security side, you need to change the architecture in which you are developing your strategy. So far, this has been a part of the Ministry of Interior, and an independent agency has to be built so that you can have the tactics being developed within that agency. Secondly, you need to have very strong police. And that doesn't mean to have just more police and better trained and better equipped, which actually you need to have. But you need to re-engineer the police organization in Mexico. Polices in Mexico were sort of designed, perhaps not intentionally, but that's the way they were, in order to contend or to contain the social unrest I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago. But they were never trained to do research and investigation of a specific case, or even more so to do prevention, which is what you will be asking for a police officer. So you need to actually retrain and to re-engineer the police organizations in Mexico, and that's why Dr. Meade is proposing that. You also need to have a more independent and better trained investigation capabilities. We have an Agencia de Investigación Criminal, a criminal investigation agency, that has about 1/4 of the investigators that you need to come up with a reasonable number of cases to be solved. There are about 2 million crimes committed in Mexico every year. If you were going to say that a criminal will commit some 4 to 5 per year, you end up with about 400,000 crimes committed per person with those guys. And then if you go to the numbers, you end up with an impunity of about 98 or 97%. That means that every 3 or 2 out of 100 cases are pretty much solved. And that has to do with the capabilities of the state, of the country, to do investigation. That's why a simple proposal is to actually increase the number of investigators and to improve the quality of the investigation itself. Ambassador Wayne was very advocate when in his tenure in Mexico in Iniciativa Mérida, in Mérida Initiative, to actually improve the quality of investigation of Mexican agencies. Although a long stride had been done in that regard, I think much more we need to do in order to increase our capabilities. Along the justice problem that I mentioned, as you know, we implemented an adversarial justice system that is partly working well in certain states, but it's not working totally. And that has to do, first of all, on the actual design of the system that is a combination of, let's say, the American system with some of the ideas that the old Mexican system had in terms of, for example, reading out your statements during a trial. And that has made the system not to work properly, particularly if you don't have the possibilities of hiring a good lawyer. Yeah. So there are changes that need to be made and adjustments that need to be made in order to come up with a system that actually works, that is much closer to the people.
And you mentioned economy is number 2. So
economy is number 2.
I'd love to hear your thoughts. What is Meade's proposals for job growth, stagnant wages, concerns are really, and probably even going back to the work in your think tank, right? As people are concerned about how the workforce is changing, how is Meade seeking to address people's concerns?
Well, first of all, you need to understand that Mexico is a very significant manufacturing platform for the world, and particularly for this hemisphere. And Dr. Meade's proposal is to strengthen that platform through increasing trade, not only with the United States and Canada, but other parts of the world, in order to create more work, more employment, and to have better salaries. But I will say that the main idea behind the economic plan of Dr. Meade is to have a much better inclusion of people. In order to reduce formality, you need to have people that actually can access to a proper employment, that have a good salary, and that has to do with creating the environment in which these people can actually work. And he has proposed a program that is called Avanzar Contigo, to advance with you or go forward with you, in which the actual tactics of the program is that people are asked what are the benefits or their needs that they have, so that you can have a tailor-made approach by the government in order to, let's say, create specific programs for the needs of the people. Not that you will just create the programs that you think the people will need, but actually ask the people what are their needs. Yeah. This will be a tailor-made type of approach for the government, with the idea at large that inclusion will be the main dimension in the program, and through the inclusiveness, the economic growth of the country could be improved.
And that's so critical. I mean, 6 in 10 about 60% of the population of Mexico that participates in the informal economy. I mean, this is a huge concern. It's such a critical proposal for the president.
It is a critical proposal that has different ramifications. One of them has to do with empowerment of women. About 50% of the population, a little bit more, in certain communities even more than that. Women take care of their own families. They are heads of their own households. They work for themselves in order to get the wages that the family needs, or they work for someone else. And in many of these instances, women need to be empowered by having daycare facilities for children, daycare facilities for adults, that in order for them to actually work in a better environment. Also, one thing that Dr. Meade has been proposing is to have a same salary, same work type of policy. There is a 70% salary or a 30% difference, so the women get pretty much on the average 70% of the salary that men get for the same type of work. And that is certainly not acceptable. And for Dr. Meade, that's something that has to be solved. And so in this Avanzar Contigo, there is a particular emphasis on the importance of women in the economy and the possibility that women have not only to empower themselves, but also to have a positive impact in the community. Same thing along the lines is on the support for the youth. And we have a large base of young people, talented, that they are aiming at using their creativity and their talent for themselves and for the country. And what they are expecting is programs in which their entrepreneurial interests are incentivized, and in which they can get scholarships for transportation, scholarships for the universities or for high schools. Yeah. And so the program itself is also including this type of supports.
You also mentioned, Sergio, you mentioned corruption as being another key concern for the campaign. Obviously, José Antonio Meade has to, working as campaign in an environment in which there is so much popular angst about corruption, not only in Mexico, but as we saw, I guess that was last week or 2 weeks ago, the Summit of the Americas, right? That corruption is a regional, I mean, it's long been a regional problem and frankly a global problem, but you have a citizen awakening to the fact that this is just not a elite cause problem that affects the elite, but it's a elite cause problem that affects the everyday person, right? And there's that real awakening in Mexico and across the hemisphere. How does candidate Meade address people's concerns in a way that Mexican people think that his proposals will actually change what has long been a systemic challenge in Mexico in particular?
Well, I would say that there is a significant difference from other campaigns in the way this problem has been approached. Well, first of all, José Antonio has been very clear that corruption will not be tolerated in his government. And he's saying that because he has the moral support of being himself a very honest man. And there has not been any scandal whatsoever in the way he lives and his family and so forth, which is quite different from the other candidates that had been pinpoint on different issues related to the way they live. Mr. López Obrador himself, for example, has never paid taxes in the past some 12 years. He doesn't have a banking account. He uses cash for his activities, for paying for the planes and cars and what have you. And then the question comes in, how do you explain that kind of a life? And the same happens with Mr. Anaya, and in which he has been involved in money laundering cases, not very clearly solved. So what Mr. Meade is proposing is to make a simple declaration and compulsory to any public servant. That means not only to present publicly what are your gains, what are your wages, what have been your salaries, but also to present a consistent declaration of that your salaries are consistent with the way or the quality of life that you are having. And he has also been proposing the independence of fiscals or attorney generals. That has not been the case in Mexico in the past. That it would be significant for any corruption case to be tried and to be prosecuted. And these are simple measures, along with the justice that I just mentioned, in order to curb down the corruption. Making the contracts, the public contracts, transparent is another way of also trying to reduce or curbing down corruption. Certainly, corruption is quite large, not only at the federal level, at state level, and local levels. The main challenge, I do think, is not only at the federal level, is at the local level, where the quality of justice and implementing this sort of investigation activities is much more complicated. And it will be more complicated if you have different ways of approaching corruption, and in case all criminal cases in different ways at the local level. That's why Dr. Meade is proposing to have a simple and the same way and the same approach for identifying criminal cases in the country for all states.
Very, very important. I want to get to the debate. How many people here watched the debate or saw post-debate coverage or had read about? Okay, so a good segment of the audience here. Sergio, how do you what do you see as a strategy for the campaign? This was a big moment, having the first debate. The next one will be in a few weeks from now in May. How do you think the debate turned out for José Antonio Meade, and as well, what is the strategy of the campaign now following the debate?
Well, I think the results of the debate were pretty much what we expected. We saw José Antonio making proposals and being a very propositive candidate, and being very secure, very presidential. And I think that was clear for the audience, and the polls showed that his performance was pretty good. Then we saw Anaya, who's a very good debater, with very simple proposals, if not any proposal. And the main problem with that campaign is that you have two parties that come from very different backgrounds, that they don't agree in very simple issues. And simple issues being the energy reform, being the educational reform, or the fiscal reform. So it's very simple for that campaign to have a very sound proposal. And if you just read the proposals, for example, from clean energy that was presented last week, the first thing they say, they want to capture solar energy. I don't know how can you capture solar energy. You can use solar energy, you can transform solar energy, but capture solar energy is not like capturing water. And that tells you that there is a kind of a fundamental problem in the proposal of the campaign. And in the case of López Obrador, I think that you saw a candidate that is a vulnerable candidate in his personal way, of the personal attitude in which he presents himself as a candidate of being an honest and just a non-corrupt candidate, when he was approached of his assets and the two apartments that he has. And actually, there are two apartments that are on his name, although he has no acknowledged that. And then the other two candidates, I think they played the role they had to play, and they were, as we had expected. What would be the future of the campaign? The future of the campaign is we'll continue trying to explain to the voter what are the differences in the proposal that Dr. Meade is presenting as compared to the consequences of voting, particularly for López Obrador. And López Obrador proposals will turn the country back to the 1980s, 1970s, into was a closed economy, in which at the time we had a foreign investment of $1 billion US, as compared to, let's say, the $27 billion that we had just last year. So there will be a pretty big difference in the way the country is seen. I think at the end, what you're seeing in this campaign, there are two ways of approaching the development of a country. In a country that will be markedly open in its economy, that will go for the future based on economic fundamentals, but also saying that inequalities has to be reduced by the progressive the policies like inclusiveness, as I mentioned, and the other model, which is López Obrador model, in which you will have a closed economy, you will have a large influence of a state in influencing not only the economy, but even more so politics and the actual social fabric of the country, and that will be very polarizing for parts of the society. And so the main logic of the campaign is to explain to the voter what are the consequences of voting for one model versus the other model.
So I'd like to, Sergio, switch topics to NAFTA, something that all of us are following on a regular basis, maybe even on a minute-by-minute basis sometimes these days. We might be potentially driving toward the finish line of a potential preliminary agreement on NAFTA, but you never know until you know. What are José Antonio Meade's priorities for the NAFTA renegotiations? Do his priorities differ in any way from President Peña Nieto's, and how do his priorities as well differ from that of the other candidates?
Well, I think the priorities of Dr. Meade are very well aligned to the priorities that this administration has set up. He has, as you know, was member of the Ministry of Finance. Well, he was member of the government, being the finance minister. He was in charge of developing the policies and the strategy for NAFTA. So he's very pro NAFTA, and he understands very well that the agreement has to be strengthened, has to be modernized, and he's very open for the discussions that have been taken care of. Of course, as we are very concerned about the sunset clause, for example, we are concerned that migration is not involved in the trade, that there is no need to do that. Certainly, temporary labor mobility is a topic that has to be included. But more so than that, I think it is very well aligned to the need to have an improved and modernized NAFTA, and as well as he's very pro foreign trade in general, and he's very interested not only in talking about NAFTA, but also improving the trade or increasing the trade that Mexico has with other nations. When he was foreign minister, he was very involved with the Pacific Alliance, and he made long strides to improve the trade and to facilitate the relation among the countries that compose or comprise the Pacific Alliance. And that just shows that he's committed to open market and to a free trade as a country, as a basis for the economic of the country.
So there's no, within the current negotiations, no proposals that are on the table that José Antonio Meade disagrees with?
Not from the Mexican side.
Not from the Mexican side. Okay. The other big the trade front is, I think it was just over the weekend that the European Union and Mexico announced an agreement in principle to update their 18-year accord. And President Peña Nieto is, of course, in Europe as well as when that was announced. How do you see? José Antonio Meade is in favor of open markets and free trade. How do you see a deepening of the partnership with the European Union? How does he see that as having kind of broader implications for Mexico's commercial strategy? And what are the implications of that for NAFTA, or are there any implications of that for North American trade?
Well, in terms of foreign policy, José Antonio has a very clear understanding that Mexico plays a significant role in the world in different ways because of the importance that Mexico has in different areas or regions in the world. Of course, we're part of North America, so that means that for Mexico it's very significant what happens in Canada and the United States and the interrelation that the three countries have, particularly between Mexico and the United States. But also he understands that we are part of the Latin American hemisphere and that Mexico has politically, socially, and economically a leading role in Latin America. And that trade, particularly with your question, with the Latin American countries has to be significant, and that's why the Pacific Alliance has been or was encouraged during the tenure of Dr. Meade as foreign minister. And he understands that, for example, the Pacific Alliance, they are trading pretty much finished goods. However, we have enlarged the value chain in the Pacific Alliance, and this is something that he will be interested not only in just trading finished products, but also trying, as we do with the North American hemisphere, trying to build or to produce things together. Similarly with Europe or with Asia in general. Yeah. And we have a very large commitment with Japan and with Korea, same thing we have with other European countries. And the idea of just enlarging our base for trade is something that he's interested in.
And of course the TPP-11 that Mexico is a part of as well, that was just signed last month. I want to touch on the energy reforms as well. We've done some work on energy reforms. I know the Wilson Center in Mexico has done some work as well. What do you? So there's some concern during the campaign about what is going to be the status of those energy reforms after the election potentially. What is your impression first, of the campaign's perspective, of how effective the reforms have been thus far? What would there be a need for tweaks moving forward in order to kind of capture Mexico's potential as a stronger energy industrial power?
Well, in terms of energy, one advantage that José Antonio has is that he was Minister of Energy, so he knows the sector quite well. From inside and outside. Inside being the Minister of Energy and outside being the Minister of Finance. That for the Minister of Finance, the energy sector is quite significant. One thing is that the energy sector, I will say the oil exportations and the oil income revenue has lowered in Mexico quite significantly. Over 80% of the revenue from Mexico comes from manufacturing, not from oil as they were in the past. And this is quite particularly important when you compare the strategies or the proposals of the campaigns. The López Obrador campaign, it will try to go back to the oil revenue being more important than it was, which will be some anti-systemic, if you will, and anti-climatic in terms of what other countries are doing. In terms of the energy reform itself, Dr. Meade is an advocate of the energy reform. He understands not only the energy reform, but other reforms, that some changes have to be made and some adjustments. That's the case of the educational reform, in which you need to work with the teachers' union, you need to work with other advocates and interested parties to actually have a much deeper educational reform, not only in terms of the administration itself, but on the topics, on the subjects of the educational reform. More so in the energy reform. I think the energy reform tried to please many groups, and at the end you ended up with, in certain cases, a lot of hurdles in order to get a permit for a particular project. And that, I think, has sort of harmed the possibility of developing much larger projects. Those are the kind of things that need to be tweaked and need to be adjusted. And in terms of clean energy, he has been an advocate of clean energy. His proposal is to increase the base of clean energy, solar, particularly because of the prices that you have in solar and wind energy right now, but also to comply with the commitments that Mexico has made internationally in the Paris Accord, which is something that he was also an advocate when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. So in short, I think he's very pro the energy reform, but he also understands there is an adjustment that has to be made.
One more question, and then we'll open up to the questions of the audience. So start thinking about your questions. I see Diana in the second row here. We'll have the first question. You're quickest to raise your hand, Diana. Mexico's view of the U.S., Mexicans' view of the U.S. right now is at an all-time low for reasons that are known to everybody in this room. To what degree is this impacting the election? To what degree do comments from the White House impact the election? Or do you see them as having kind of minimal effect on a day-to-day level, and minimal effect on how in the end, you outlined in the beginning, so here are the 4 priorities for the Meade campaign, right? So none of those priorities were around the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So do comments on Mexico, or does the all-time low of the kind of Mexicans' perception of the U.S. have some type of effect on the campaign?
Well, first of all, you need to understand that Mexicans are very provincial. We don't tend to think too much on international arena, so which is good and bad. But it's good in the sense that so far that topic has not been that surfaced in the campaign, and pretty much all topics have to do with the mentions that I just said. I will think that I will change in the next few weeks, because the second debate is about foreign policy. It's about the Mexicans living abroad and the migrant community, and it's about foreign trade. And that's going to happen in Tijuana. That is, of course, a hub on these topics. And so I think those topics will come out first in the first few weeks of May, perhaps, and middle of May, and then, of course, during the debate. I don't know to what extent that will influence the rest of the campaign. I think afterwards, that's my opinion, we will go back to the domestic agenda. That is where the people feel more comfortable, they are more interested into it. And so I think there will be pretty much like a spike within the campaign. Of course, we are pretty much aware of what happens in the U.S. and the tweets of President Trump and so forth, but so far that has not impacted or changed the election. And it's interesting now that you were asking that question, I was just reflecting on the idea that any other of the campaigns have the issue of foreign policy or the relation with the U.S. as a critical issue in their campaigns. They are pretty much talking about the same topics that I've just mentioned.
Right. In the end, people vote on what's most important for their everyday lives.
For their everyday lives, yes.
For their everyday lives. Diana, and then a question behind you as well.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte, also from the Wilson Center. Dr. Alcocer, thank you for joining us, coming back to Washington, which you knew so well when you were Undersecretary for North American Affairs. Historically, the PRI has had a very close relationship with the two education unions. But in 2013, you began a significant reform of the educational system, which impacted those unions considerably. Can the PRI as a party still count on those unions to deliver votes? And if so, what are they asking for in exchange?
Thanks, Diana. Let's actually take both questions together. Yeah, please.
Buenos días. Max Trujillo with MUT Policy Government Affairs firm here in Washington. You touch upon immigration as a topic, not necessarily to be within NAFTA, except for the particular working issues. In the U.S. media, there's been a lot of attention of the so-called caravan coming up through Mexico on the way to actually Tijuana. As a national security issue for Mexico, what do you feel are the potential partnerships that Mexico can have with the U.S. government in terms of dealing or engaging with Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala? Because it is a national security issue for Mexico. You can't just have 200,000 people coming through your country. I'm sure that that's some sort of issue, maybe in the campaign, but that hasn't been shown up here, and I wanted to know if that was an issue in the campaign as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, on the issue of teachers' union, yes, certainly there has been a very close relation of the PRI with the teachers' union. Because of the educational reform, part of the teachers' union was sort of isolated. And on the one hand, not only because some of them opposed to the educational reform, because of the way the educational reform was implemented. And that's when I was saying that the reforms need to be modified or adjusted. What Dr. Meade is proposing is that the next steps of the educational reform, you need to make them along with the teachers' union, and you need to listen to the teachers' union. The participation in a classroom is not only the teacher and the students. You need to take the opinion of the families themselves, but also of other actors that either propose or develop material, that participate in different ways in the educational system. And you need to involve them also in the reform. And this is something that was not, I think, properly done during the implementation of the educational reform. So what Dr. Meade is proposing is, let's get back to the table, let's have a conversation with all the stakeholders and try to understand what will be the best for the students and for the knowledge transfer for the students. In that regard, there is an active role of attracting the teachers' union to the pre-campaign and to the coalition, because one of the parties from the coalition actually comes from the teachers' union, and to be as proactive as possible in order to attract the voters. So yes, we are working on that. And on the caravan, that certainly, as you say, and it's properly said, that it's a national security issue. As you know, our constitution, our laws require for the government to not to foster, but to take care of all migrants that cross the country. In that regard, the Mexican government is complying with the law. But that is not to be said that the main problem that we are facing as a hemisphere is the large differences that are present in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I think that we had some progress when President Obama and Ambassador Wayne were in office, in which we engaged in a very significant dialogue on how to improve the quality of life, the economy of those countries. There are just systematic differences or very objective differences, but just the cost of electricity or the cost of energy in general in those countries is much larger than in other parts, like in Mexico, for example. So if you want to produce a single unit of whatever you want, there will be a much larger, 20-30% larger cost in those countries. So their economies are not competitive. So it will be in the best interest of Mexico and the U.S. to participate in a joint program in order to improve the competitiveness of those economies so that their people could have or could get jobs in their countries. And of course, that has also to do with the security problems in Honduras, particularly in El Salvador. And but solving the economical problem, that will also tend to solve their violence in those countries. So I think I would say the best foreign policy for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the best social policy for them, and I will say justice policy, will be the economical policy. So if you can try to solve the differences in those countries.
And you've seen significant inroads from Mexico's part in the last few years. I mean, Mexico recognizing that what happens in the Northern Triangle very much impacts Mexico itself, right?
Yes.
Getting more involved, co-hosting with the United States back in June, the Central America summit down in Miami. So there's been a lot of actions taken by the current Mexican government to try to, whether it's the Southern Border Program or economic development opportunities in the Northern Triangle. Other questions? Duncan in the first row, and then we'll take the last row as well. Duncan's question first.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about the importance of having transparency, fighting corruption in contracts.
Yeah.
One of the strongest points of the energy reform was the bidding process,
yes.
The transparency of it. And I was lucky enough to attend 2 of those bidding rounds, and I was just so impressed. But coming out of it, I said, why can't the Mexican government do this for every major contract? And the fact is, you could, but there hasn't been the political will to do that.
That's true.
And I feel that at this point in time, at least one of the candidates should be putting forward an idea to say that on big government contracts, anything more than $5, $10 million, whatever it is, that there could be this kind of transparency that we put in place. It's not rocket science. It's easy to do. We can webcast it live, etc. And if these kind of things had been done, for example, with the contracts for the airport, there would be much fewer questions about the legitimacy of that. So I'd just be interested in hearing your response to that.
Thanks. Well, let's take the other question in the back, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
Andrea Tango from the Mexico Institute. Dr. Alcocer, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Meade's proposal to tackle income inequality and just in general inequality in the country. What would he do different that was not made in the last 6 years? What would be the different proposals he would make?
Well, regarding the contracting and let's say the acquisitions in general from the government, as you say, I think the energy reform opened a different way of doing this, and Dr. Meade has been proposing the very same for all contracts. And this is the very last statement that he made during the debate of having open contracts or being public. That's the idea. They are doing this at the airport. However, it's not as widely publicized as in the energy reform. And they are open bidding, and everything is public, and everything is transparent. So if you look actually to the details of those contracts, the contracts are there in the website. Certainly, they are not presented in an amicable fashion. You have to go and read thousands of pages to understand what the contract is. And I understand that the people in the airport are doing the best they can to present in a much simpler fashion so that any person can just look in the website without being a specialist to understand what is happening with the contract. But I think your idea is exactly what Dr. Meade's his intention is, to have an open government in terms of being open and transparent to the way that the Mexican government hires or contracts or buys things and infrastructure or whatever. And in terms of the social inclusiveness program, Dr. Meade, during his tenure as Minister of Social Development, clearly understood that you needed to have a specific strategy in order to reduce the poverty that affects some 40 million people in Mexico or so. And in order to do that, rather than developing programs, umbrella programs that will try to cover all the needs that people have, the idea of Dr. Meade is to go the other direction. So let's ask the people what are the actual needs, so that a tailor-made program has been made for the need of the people. That doesn't mean that you will have 125 million programs on this, but that you can sort of package them according to the actual needs of the people. And that's the case, for example, when you talk to a student and he will tell you or she will tell you that he will need a transportation scholarship. Well, if you don't ask them, this is something that it will not surface immediately. So the idea of this Avanzar Contigo program is to go back in a different way, saying, let's have a tailor-made government that can really go into the details of the needs of the people and have the public policy affecting positively, of course, the lives of the people. So that's the approach that he's proposing in Avanzar Contigo program, which is a program that is already underway during the campaign, getting information from the people in order so that when Dr. Meade becomes the president, he will have the tools to actually implement that program.
So, Sergio, we don't always start on time, but we always end on time. And so I wanted to honor that. And before ending, I want to again thank Duncan and Chris and the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute for their partnership and also their friendship and these events and everything that we do together. And also Catherine Pereira, who manages the Mexico portfolio at the Atlantic Council and has been working with the team to put on this event. All of you for joining, and most importantly, Sergio, thank you. Thank you for coming, but also thank you for coming. It's a 24-hour trip you're making to Washington to do a few things and to be with us today. I know it's an incredibly busy time for you, a lot of time away from family, working on the campaign, and just really can't thank you enough for taking the time to come to Washington for this discussion today. It's been really, I think, helpful for everyone's insight into the campaign, insight into where Mexico is heading, and we look forward to continuing to work with you moving forward.
Well, again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and just a final message. I think that Mexico is at a crossroads from this election. We are talking about two different models, very different models, that would have very bad consequences for the country. And if we are concerned, you ought to be also concerned if López Obrador wins. So that's why we are also working very heavily, very hardly to convince the voter on what the consequences would be if Mr. López Obrador wins, and differently from if Dr. Meade wins, which is we need a change, there was a transformation, but you needed to have in an orderly fashion and with a clear path, and this is what Dr. Meade proposes.
Well, thank you, Sergio. And again, we'll be convening again next week for a discussion with the Anaya campaign. Thank you very much, Sergio.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your comments.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.